Episode 146, Suicide and the Communion of Saints. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, we're talking about the Christian response to suicide. My guest is priest and author Rhonda Mawhood Lee. She writes compassionately about suicide, and her book gives some great practical advice. You do not need to be a Christian to benefit from her book. As always, see the show notes for further information. And if you are suffering from poor mental health, please speak to the appropriate professionals and confide in someone you can trust. There are additional mental health resources listed in the show notes. Because of the sensitive nature of this topic, I invited my wife Sarah to guest host with me. I think she contributed positively to this episode. I hope you appreciate her input, and if you wish to send feedback on this collaboration, contact me at reasonpress@gmail.com. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This episode will come, or rather does come if it's not already obvious from the title of the episode, a little bit of a content warning. But just to clarify things, just to put you at ease, we're not talking about the action, the activity, or how to achieve it. We're talking about caring for people and the consequences of this ought to be, and this will be, I guarantee, a loving episode of Still Unbelievable. So with that said, actually, before I get on to my real guest, I do have a special co-host here on Still Unbelievable today. For the first time ever on Still Unbelievable, he's a person who's been heard about a few times on several episodes. If you've paid any attention to the back catalogue of the Graceful Atheist podcast, you will have heard her on that. Somebody who has tolerated me for a good many years, and in recognition of her achievement of that, she now has got a degree in child psychology. So congratulations, Sarah, and welcome to Still Unbelievable. Why are you here?
Hello, Matthew. Well, as Matthew said, my name is Sarah. I have been married to Matthew for 31 years. 31 years. I work with vulnerable children and young people, and they are often impacted by their parents' mental health and their own mental health. And therefore, I have a master's degree in mental health in children and young people. That is my passion and my specialist subject. And apart from that, I am a Christian, and I am in pastoral leadership in my local church.
And in case you didn't hear right, listeners, not only is Sarah more intelligent than me, she's got a piece of paper to prove it. Rhonda, our guest today, I brought Sarah on because of your book to have this conversation with yourself. So I got Erdmans reached out to me and said, Matt, I've got an interesting book. Yeah, it's a little bit different to your usual content, to the usual authors that you interview. How do you feel about this one? And I thought about it for a day or two, to be quite honest. And I thought, you know what? This is probably a conversation that I actually should have. So, Rhonda Mawhood Lee, thank you so much for your book. I found it compassionate. I found it tender. It educated me, and it made me cry. So thank you so much for coming on to Still Unbelievable. Tell my listeners about yourself, why you wrote this book.
Thank you, Matthew, for having me, and thank you, Sarah, for being on with. Yes, I'm Rhonda Mawhood Lee, and I wrote this book because I am a survivor of suicide. My mother died by suicide when she was 52 and I was 28, and I discovered subsequently that a number of people in my family had died by suicide. My mother's first attempt that I know of, she made when I was 12. I had just turned 12. And so my life since the age of 12 has been marked by suicide and by living with parents who struggled with mental illness that was undiagnosed, untreated, and in my mother's case, ultimately fatal. I am now a priest in the Episcopal Church in the United States. That's the Church of England sort of daughter church in the United States. I'm originally Canadian. I'm still Canadian, but I came here to do a PhD in U.S. history years and years ago and married an American, and here I am. So I serve as a parish priest. I write and I do various other things like historical research for churches from time to time, things like that. So that's who I am.
Thank you, Rhonda. Now, your book is called Suicide in the Communion of Saints. So that's very definitively puts your book into the Christian camp. The title screams out, I'm aimed at Christians. Do you only want Christians to read your book?
Thank you for asking that. I think it is aimed in the first instance at Christians, but I do think the book can be helpful for people who live in places, which is much of the world, where discussions about suicide have been shaped by Christian theology. So even if a person is not Christian, the arguments about suicide they hear may largely be shaped by Christianity, by Christian theology, or what people think is Christian theology. And then I also hope that the book will be helpful for people who have been harmed by Christian theology, whether around suicide or around some other forms of trauma, for example, sexual assault. I hope that there will be something in the book that might validate those people's sense, whether they're Christian or not, that what the church taught them or what they believed the church taught about suicide or, for example, sexual assault was not true. And my book acknowledges that Christian ideas about suicide have done a lot of harm.
Yes, thank you for saying that. And listeners, as always, links in the show notes to the book, to places where you can buy the book, and to more information about Rhonda herself. You do a very good job, Rhonda, of acknowledging the language around suicide and where certain Christian theologies have created and caused harm around that language. And I think the way that you acknowledge that, like the entirety of the book and the way that you write, is very tender, very educational, and I genuinely appreciate that. And listeners, I think you will appreciate that too. But what I appreciated the most about the book, right at the very beginning, you go into detail about the language of suicide, how we talk about suicide is important, how the words that we use to describe suicide can frame ideas, can frame opinions. Can you just clarify for my listeners why how we talk about suicide is important and what phrases we should avoid and what phrases we should encourage?
Yes, thank you. Language can convey judgment. The way we say something conveys, in part, what we think about that thing. And so I really avoid talking about, quote unquote, committing suicide, because that implies, clearly it has been used for centuries, that term has been used to imply that suicide is a sin, a crime, or both. And in many places, it has been both. And so I say instead, someone died by suicide. I will say my mother died by suicide. I'll use the language, she killed herself. That's just a statement of fact. I think it's important to say that someone attempted suicide or someone completed suicide. Is another way to say someone died that way. Occasionally, I will see a report that someone made a quote unquote unsuccessful attempt. And that's just repellent to me because it paints a death by suicide as some kind of success. I can absolutely understand a suicidal person using that language about themselves. I have heard suicidal people say, well, I was unsuccessful. They're talking about their experience and their perception of their experience. And that is their prerogative. But I don't find it appropriate for other people to do so. Again, because it suggests that for someone to die by their own hand would be some kind of success. So I encourage as neutral language as possible around suicide.
Thank you, Rhonda. I genuinely appreciated that part of the book. It educated me. It made me rethink words like unsuccessful and committed, words that I know that I have used or at least thought in the past. So certainly for me, yes. And I think if nothing else is taken from the book, that passage, that section of your book is worth the cover price on its own.
Thank you.
Sarah, did you have any thoughts, questions?
Nothing to add to that. I mean, equally, I was educated by that, and I absolutely agree with you. I think that is very, very important how we use the language, not just around suicide, but around mental health as well. I think it's critical how we talk about these things. And for me, normalising mental health is something that I am very keen that we, as Christians, that we normalise mental health struggles. And that we don't, along with suicide, that we don't make those into a sin that is worse, or even, that is a sin, than any other. So, yeah, I really appreciated that.
And I think that's somewhere where I'd actually like to move next. But before I get there was also a part about where you said in terms of thinking about suicide and thinking about the motivations of suicide, you say very clearly and very succinctly, suicide is not a desire for death, it's a desire for peace. And I think that, again, is something that we need to be aware of, something that we need to acknowledge. And why did you feel it was important to make that statement?
Well, I think it's true. I think there's so many testimonies from people who have attempted suicide, from notes that people leave behind, that they are in terrible pain. And we know there have been studies done of people who are in what we would call psychic pain, emotional pain, and the same parts of their brain light up, and Sarah's nodding here, as if we were experiencing physical pain. As someone who has experienced clinical depression, I can relate. And so people who attempt suicide, for the most part, not everybody, not all the time, are in terrible pain. And they want the pain to end. And whether they've had treatment, whether their depression, usually depression, not always, is resistant to treatment. Generalizations are always dangerous, but it has been well documented that people who attempt suicide, who want to die by suicide, are typically looking to end the pain they're in.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we touched on earlier about how suicide is seen and how suicide is interpreted. In terms of what you're trying to challenge, in terms of the thoughts of what you're trying to challenge in terms of other people's attitudes to suicide, what is your main goal?
I say in the book that, and this may or may not be of interest to your usual listenership, my main goal is to change the conversation about suicide and to change the theological conception of suicide. Much of Christian discourse around suicide has been to discuss whether or not suicide is a sin for the person who does it. And then following on from that, if it is a sin, then is that person necessarily condemned to hell? And for much of Christian history, a lot of people would have responded yes and yes. I instead, as a Christian, see suicide as one manifestation, and for many of us, a particularly painful manifestation of the reality that we live in a world that is marked by sin and death, where things are not as we would like them to be, where things are not as we believe God intends them to be. And so instead of saying, is it a sin for this person to attempt suicide or to complete suicide or not, I instead encourage us to see it as a sign of the world being not as we wish it would be, and to respond to people in that way, to respond to people who are at risk by suicide or who die by suicide. All of us live in this world together, and that's all Christians and everybody who's not Christian. We are all in it together, and we all have to deal with the struggles of life, with the fact that we live in a world that's not perfect, and with the reality that most of us want to make the world better than it is. We want to show care for other people in whatever ways make sense for them. And so that's where I use the concept of the communion of saints. Other theologians have done this. Elizabeth Antus, A-N-T-U-S, is a Catholic theologian in the United States who has written about how people who die by suicide are still members of the communion of saints. They're still related to us, to their siblings in Christ. Just as Sarah and I are, for example. And so that's what I wanted to do, was expand the lens and not focus on these people and these individuals and say, oh, well, should we, are we judging them? Are we not judging them? Are we judging them? Or are we afraid to judge them? But let's pull out and see the pain we live with and the particular pains some of us live with, and see how we can respond without putting ourselves in the place of God and trying to tally up any one person's account, which is not how I believe God works anyway, but without sitting in judgment of any one person.
For the listeners, Elizabeth Antus, who Rhonda has just mentioned, section number 6 in the show notes, there are several links there already. I've already been through and collected all of those. Elizabeth does seem to be quite prolific on this subject, so do look her up. Start with the show notes.
Something that struck me about what you just said was that thing of sitting in judgment over, over our fellow Christians or fellow human beings for that matter, because, we all sit in judgment all the time, don't we? And for me, that practice of sitting in judgment isn't just related to suicide. It's related to anything that Christians have considered to be sin. And it is a bad practice, because my understanding is that God's word is absolutely clear that there is one judge and one judge alone, and therefore it is not for us to sit in judgment. It is for us to love. And so I think that is absolutely where I identified with everything that you've written. And I think, just perhaps what Matthew was getting at here, just sort of moving on, was I wonder, do you have sympathies with a universalist approach towards redemption?
I think thank you for asking that. I wanted to back up a tiny bit just to say, there's a piece that I loved, that I made sure to include in the book from Shakespeare's play Hamlet, where Laertes, I can never pronounce that properly. Anyway, Ophelia's brother, Ophelia has died, and the priest will only do a very abbreviated rite for her as he buries her. And of course, it's a hymn at that time. He will only do a very abbreviated rite. And he says it's not right to have a full service of burial for one who died by her own hand. And Ophelia's brother says, a ministering angel will my sister be when thou liest howling. In other words, you have no right to judge, and I think actually she is not only saved, but she is in the realm of the angels now. So I thought about this question about universal salvation, and I'm reluctant to get into a deep discussion about it. I think you and I agree, Sarah, that ideas about suicide automatically, so to speak, condemning a person to hell are presumptuous. They presume to know the state of the soul of the person who died, and they presume to stand in the place of God. And both of these presumptions are inappropriate for Christians. I am sympathetic to the universalist approach. I personally, Anglicans are not supposed to believe this, but that's okay. I believe something like a state of purgatory. I do believe that we probably have some things to burn off, not like in a hellfire kind of way, but in a metaphorical kind of way. Some things to be rid of. The Psalms talk about purifying fire.
I was going to say, you mean refining fire, don't you?
Refining fire, thank you. Yes, look at you. So no one really knows, first of all. But if I had to say what I believe we do go through some sort of purification after our earthly death. As to whether God's grace is in the end irresistible, in other words, whether or not it's possible for human beings to be so recalcitrant that they will not accept the grace of God, I don't know. I mean, maybe. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating, and you're absolutely right. This isn't the time or place to go into it. And I asked because I have sympathies with that approach, definitely. I come back to therefore there is no condemnation. And I think that it's very easy to get caught up in, the rights and wrongs of different things and which sins might separate us from God. And the bottom line is, Christianity also says, Scripture also says that we are all sinners. Yes. And we have all fallen short, and no one is better than the other. So,
and I think that's true. And yet, I think you and I could have a really good conversation about this over a cup of tea or a whiskey or something. Because I do think, some sins are worse than others. Some sins are worse than others, and I just keep coming back to, I am not the one to judge. And so I might place restraints on a person. I might say, as a priest, I might say, find you a different place to worship. If you committed a sin, an aggression against another member of the congregation, we do believe in some discipline within the church and among the church. And so there are boundaries, but when you're talking about the fate of someone's soul, for anyone, I can totally understand someone saying, I hope he's in hell. I get it. We're human. Or I hope she's in hell, but I can't imagine presuming to make any kind of declarative statement that I know what my fate is in all humility, or what someone else's fate is.
And I think, as you alluded to, the pain that somebody who attempts suicide is generally in, and I think you can apply that to a lot of other things as well, can't you? Yes. What leads you to sin, what pain there is, what trauma there is in your childhood, what's going on for you emotionally that actually leads you into that thing. And really interestingly, actually, was having a conversation with our daughter this morning. I had the pleasure of a couple of hours in the car with her this morning. She's 21 and she has a Christian faith. And she was talking to me about your book because she hasn't read it, but we've both spoken to her about it and about the fact we were doing this recording this evening. And she said to me, she said, I can't fathom that the God that I believe in, if somebody was to be in so much distress that they took their own life, and that they then met God, that he would, for one moment, would say, well, no, go away. You've done wrong. Go away. I want nothing to do with you. And she said that the God I believe in is a God who will open his arms to that person and embrace them. That's essentially what I wrote in the book too. Yeah. So yes, brother and I agree. Summed up by a 21-year-old in 2 sentences. There we go. Yeah, the wisdom of the young.
Well, before you two go ahead and start booking the next Taylor family holiday, I'd like to echo and endorse what you guys have just said. While yes, it's quite obvious that I'm not a believer in God, if there is a God out there, I can't imagine it will be a God any other than what you just said. Because let's remember, somebody who dies by suicide is a victim. Yes. And if we view it from that perspective, then suddenly the conversation that we're having right now makes a whole lot more sense.
Yes. I do want to say too, not to go too far off topic, but I do want to say that we've zoomed out pretty far and to sort of what we hope is the God's eye view, what we believe is the God's eye view, or believe could potentially be the God's eye view from your perspective, Matthew. I do want to say that for people who are bereaved by suicide, it is typical, and Sarah, I know you know this, to have many different emotions. And so the person who's bereaved by suicide may feel anger, may feel contempt at times, might feel relief, might feel a variety of things. And they're very understandable, sometimes mixed emotions don't then mean that the person who dies by suicide is condemned by God. Suicide it's a brutal act. It's violent, even when the person uses a bloodless method, And so our stance towards survivors of suicide also has to be compassion. Mm-hmm. And it's important for survivors to have a safe place to let out their emotions, whatever those might be, sadness, compassion, but also potentially rage, abandonment, or again, relief, which can sometimes be, they might be reluctant to express relief, but it can be very real.
Yes, I'd like to move on to that actually, because there are other victims of suicide, and that is those who are left behind, those who are close family members, those who love them dearly, and even those who are friends and acquaintances. Lots of people suffer as a result of that. And I can't remember, I don't know how much of this Sarah knows or remembers, but many years ago I had a cousin who tragically died by drugs overdose. And during a conversation with some family members, one family member did actually suggest that it might have been intentional. And they saw it as a release, as a way of them coping. Whereas my emotional reaction was exactly the opposite. I saw it as a horror, as a tragedy, and I mentally couldn't take that on board. So for me, it has always been a tragic accident. I obviously don't know the truth, but it was interesting though that the two reactions of family members of this cousin were very different in that way. Do you see that in people who have survived suicide like this? And how do we as humans care for those people the best way?
Yes, I think listening is very important. Listening, I think spreading the word, Sarah, you were talking at the beginning of our time together about needing to support people's mental health. And so just normalizing, spreading the word to all of us that a range of emotional responses is to be expected, normal. The responses can vary over time, and that's fine. And so just being present and listening to someone. Some people may need, more specialized listening, a professional like Sarah. Obviously, I think mental health access should be better and greater than it is just about anywhere I can think of. And also support groups can be very helpful. And those can be secular, they can be within churches or other houses of worship. But the whole point of a support group is to realize that one is not alone, that one has fellow travelers along the way. And so I think listening is the most important thing. I say in the book, too, that I do think material forms of support for people who are struggling with suicide, suicidal ideation or having an attempt. So material support for them and their families is important too. It's, if you're really depressed, it's hard to cook and feed your family, some meals dropped off would be a very helpful, simple thing that friends, neighbors, members of a church or whatever can do. So I think listening and then looking for material, helpful acts that we can do is important. So pretty simple. But getting over the hump of being afraid to talk about suicide or being afraid to acknowledge the person is bereaved or is struggling in some way. That I think is often the biggest obstacle, which can also be the case if we're afraid to acknowledge that someone is struggling with substance use disorder or something like that. We have parallel.
And I think something, just to pick up on that, you were very, very honest in the book about your feelings when your mother died, that you were sad and you were grieving, but to a certain extent you were relieved because she was difficult to live with.
Yes.
And I think that we need to acknowledge, again, as humans, as Christians, as people, as human beings, that people who are experiencing poor mental health, whatever that is and however that manifests, they are not always easy to live with.
Right.
And so again, compassion for everybody in those circumstances, those who have lost people and those who are still experiencing and suffering from poor mental health. And I think this is where, as the church, we need to be far more proactive.
Yes.
And far more caring of those who are experiencing poor mental health, and acknowledge that it exists. Yes. That in a congregation of 100 people, probably I think it was, I can't remember what the statistics are, but I think around 1 in 4 will be suffering from mental health issues.
That makes sense. Yes. And so sometimes, I mean, that's where organizations, like we're talking about a Christian context, so the church, but it could be a number of other organizations. It's really incumbent upon us to step up and support the person who's struggling and support their families, because the family just may be done. They may have given all they can give. I mean, my mother wouldn't take help, but, I couldn't give her what she thought she needed, what she wanted, and that is why when it came time for me to do a PhD, I went to the United States to do it. So, and I think I say that in the book. So we do have to realize that, and again, this can be true if someone's struggling with a substance use disorder or other things, the family may have done, or the people closest to that person who's struggling may have done all they can do, at least for now. Maybe they can come back in later, but we really need to expand the circles of care.
Thank you for that. And leading on from Sarah's question and point about you talking about your mother, which, in case nobody had guessed, that is the part that made me cry. Is there a taboo around talking about suicide in this context?
A taboo against saying that I don't miss her?
Yes, basically.
Yeah, it usually surprises people. I have talked to a few other people. Someone emailed me recently, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. They said that sadly their spouse had died by suicide, and they were sad about it, and their main emotion was relief. And that is not something that I think most people feel safe to say.
I think this comes under the umbrella of what we were talking about earlier, about caring for those who survive this. We should give these people the freedom to express those emotions, because that's how we heal.
Exactly. That is how we heal. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and again, just bringing this to being proactive when it comes to caring for people who are suffering from mental health problems, and not just. Sorry, let me come back to that. My thought there was, you talked about the relief when a family member who has been experiencing any kind of problem then dies or is no longer with you. But what I immediately thought of there was, if you've got a family member who's an alcoholic, or you've got a family member who's a substance abuser, or you've got a family member who is struggling with any kind of issue, problem, extreme pattern of behaviour, you will feel a sense of relief if you are not having to deal with that anymore. And there is nothing wrong with that sense of relief at all. And I completely understand why you made that decision to move to the States from Canada. I think that is absolutely not just understandable, but right, because I think we owe it to ourselves as well, as family members of anybody who is struggling with some kind of issue, to care for ourselves.
Yes.
And there comes a point where you can no longer care for that other person, because it's going to impact you, but also because you can't do anything for them. You cannot, because if you are stuck in that pit of despair,
yes,
or you have a diagnosed mental health condition or undiagnosed, or something's going on there, the people around you cannot do anything to talk you out of that. And I think there's a misunderstanding about that. I think there is. I think there is some people still believe that we can, and if I can bring this back to the church, that we can pray that out of people. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely believe that we have a loving and a healing God who can and does perform miracles. Yes. But I think it's got to be compassion first for all of these things.
Yes.
And compassionate to yourself, but compassionate to the other person, compassionate to yourself in all of these things.
it would have been so helpful to me to have someone tell me that when I was 25 and needing to get on with my life. And making that decision,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to play devil's advocate for a little bit, please, Rhonda, because one of the notes that I put down while going through your book and going through your excellent conversation about the language of suicide was a thought occurred to me. If we destigmatize the language, if we make the language more neutral, if we remove the negativity of the language of suicide, do we remove the discouragement from suicide as well? Why is that question idiotic?
Well, I don't think it's idiotic. And I say, that in the book I read about my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was in this terrible position because she had been taught, as my mother was born in Scotland, so my grandmother had been taught as a child in Scotland that suicide was a mortal sin. And she would refer to suicide as self-murder. That was horrible. But she also was suicidal at different times in her life. She experienced suicidal ideation. And I truly believe that the fear of hell kept her from completing suicide.
Okay. So it can be a motivator.
For her, it had a positive effect.
Yeah.
But then her daughter died by suicide, and my grandmother lived 8 more years, believing that her daughter was in hell. So, unimaginably awful. I don't even want to imagine it. So, I don't think it's an idiotic question, but no, I don't think it's helpful to use the stigmatizing language. I do think it's better to use more neutral language, but more importantly, to talk openly about suicide and the temptation to suicide, as we have been encouraging. And I think it's important to make clear that suicide is not the answer to the person's problems. It is a temptation. So I think it's important to say that it's not the answer to their problems, and also to say, we talked earlier about how people who want to die by suicide really they want peace. They want their pain to end. Something that we can say if the time seems right is that your pain will not end. You're going to be transferring it to other people. You're going to be transferring it to the people who survive you. Not to guilt you, but think about that,
Thank you, Rhonda. And obviously, I'm already on board with that, but I think it's worth making the point. If we stigmatize something, all we do is we drive it into the dark corners, and that's where more pain lives.
Yes.
So, now, the other question I wanted to ask around about suicide, and I absolutely know that my listeners will have cottoned onto this at all, and I don't think you mention it in your book at all, and that is assisted dying. It's a big conversation that we're having in the UK. I believe it's a conversation that's being had in Canada as well, although I don't know all the politics around that. What, if any, is the relationship between suicide and assisted dying, and would the care structures for those people be the same? Would they look the same, or are there differences?
I think it's a little more complicated than that. Obviously, at the most obvious level, both suicide and assisted dying are about people seeking to escape suffering that might be intolerable. I am very leery of medical aid in dying, as it's called in Canada, or physician-assisted death, as it's often called in the US. My main concern about it is that people might be pressured to avail themselves of it for economic reasons, to save money, whether their own, as in the United States, where it's a private health insurance system, or to save the healthcare system money, as it might be in Canada or Britain. And so that's my concern about it. I'm also very aware, my father, the father who raised me, died of cancer when I was just about 23. And he was not ready to go. I was exhausted caring for him before he was finished with living. So I'm very aware that there can be very caring family members who might wittingly or unwittingly put pressure on people to die. So that's part of the equation. I do think that as far as I know, the conversation in Britain right now is around aid in dying being made available possibly to people who have a terminal diagnosis. And I think that's very important. In Canada, I think it is diabolical, much as I, respect many things about the Canadian government, that one does not have to have a terminal diagnosis. And that is, people are being pressured into killing themselves if they, can't live on disability payments, for example. So I do think it's important, if there would be a system like that, for the person to have a terminal diagnosis. So I personally am very leery of it. I am not in favor of medical aid in dying. I would rather focus on appropriate palliative care. All that being said, if I lived in a place where medical aid in dying were available and a parishioner or someone I was close to wanted me to attend them at their death, I think as a priest, a pastor, a friend, I think I would have to say yes. And that would be really hard. But at that moment, it would be their decision that I would not have to approve. Well, I would want to be present to them, and that wouldn't mean that I would make the same choice as them that way.
And in terms of supporting the family members around that, do you see that the same as supporting family members of suicide death?
I think it's. I have not done a literature review, so I don't know if there's data around this, but I do think that it is the experience of a family member using medical aid in dying is typically easier for survivors than a self-inflicted suicide, because usually the person has a terminal diagnosis. Something else is going to kill them, apparently. The person availing themselves of the aid usually makes that known to their family members and friends, so there can be an opportunity to say goodbye. It may be a more peaceful end, and there can be time to come to terms with it. So I do think that for survivors, for those who are bereaved, medical aid in dying is easy. It may not be easy spiritually or philosophically if they don't agree with the choice that is made. That's never guaranteed when we're dealing with other people. We may not approve of everything anyone does, not even ourselves.
Thank you, Rhonda. I appreciate your thoughts on that. Sarah?
Oh, that's a big one, and you didn't prepare me for that question at all. I don't disagree with you at all, Rhonda. I don't disagree with you. This is such a huge subject. It really, really is, and absolutely, I wasn't aware of what was happening in Canada about the lack of a terminal diagnosis. I do think that is wrong. I do think that opens up all sorts of pressure that you can put on people. And in fact, it could be used as a means of suicide, of completing suicide, because of depression. That does not sit well with me at all. Again, I come back to the church and caring for those who are experiencing poor mental health. And I think, is there one thing that you would say, or one scripture that you would quote to a Christian, a minister, a pastor who didn't, or who ascribed to the erroneous belief that mental health is not something that Christians should suffer from, poor mental health?
Oh, yes. Right. It's so interesting because, of course, the mindset of the Bible in some ways is very different from ours. These ancient Near Eastern texts, but I do think there are plenty of places in the Bible where people turn to skilled people for help in healing. So, David, in the first book of Samuel, David, who will become King David, plays the lyre for Saul when Saul is tormented by an evil spirit, probably what we would now call depression. And, we might call that music therapy, so they bring in this young man who is gifted in this particular way to help in certain ways. And so, likewise, Jesus assumes physicians exist. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are ill. So, and in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan cares for the man who's left beaten in the ditch, pours wine and oil on his wounds. So those are medicinal, wine, antibacterial, oil to speed healing. So these are physical illnesses and also maybe spiritual illnesses, being tormented by an evil spirit. And in all these cases, someone with skill and care is brought in to help. And so I think we have to look to those things. And I mean, of course, I have some patience with that argument, but I do have limited patience because, of course, some means of healing today are different from how they were in biblical times. Means of transportation are also different. I don't get along by camel or donkey, but some people do, and that's great. But I'm just saying, I drive a car. Our understanding of the physical sciences is different. The Genesis says for the flood to occur, the windows of the heavens were opened. Maybe that was just poetic, but maybe that was their understanding of the physical sciences. So should I be bound by that in the 21st century? Not at all. So I have some patience with that school of thought and would point to scriptural resources. And then at a certain point, I would say, come on, you don't live like someone in the ancient Near East today. You just don't.
Sure. Yeah, the 21st century is very different. Yeah.
It's very different.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Listeners, links in the show notes. Rhonda's book is worth your money. Please do read it. You will appreciate it. You will learn. You might even cry. So, Rhonda, as is tradition, thank you so much for being on Still Unbelievable. Do you have a favourite Bible character, and who are they?
I have two. I have Jonah. I know it is. I'm sorry. Jonah, the prophet Jonah, who God tells him to bring a message to the horrible Assyrian Empire. They should repent or they'll be destroyed. And Jonah says, I refuse. Bring it on. Destroy them. Make my day. So I love him. And then Job, who is suffering, and Job has the courage to demand that God explain God's self for the terrible suffering that Job is having to go through. I love those two.
Thank you, Rhonda, and I think that's the first time I've had either of them. I might have had Job previously. I'm desperately trying to remember, but I'm not absolutely convinced. Sarah, we've got 60 seconds left. Can you get...
We've got 60 seconds. It has to be... Rhonda's already mentioned him. It has to be David for me. He was a mighty man of God. He was a warrior. He was wonderful, wonderful man, but he was also a horrible sinner. He experienced depression. He experienced just about every human emotion possible. He wrote about it. He lamented. He wrote wonderful, wonderful psalms. At the end of the day, yeah, he's what an incredible man. It's probably the one I most identify with.
Thank you to so both, and until next time, stay reasonable.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Genuinely enjoyed this. Genuinely enjoyed your book.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Rhonda. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.